Hello, my dearest friends. Happy Isru Chag, and I hope that you really had a truly beautiful and meaningful Pesach. And now we go back to, well, I don't think you can call it exactly normal life, but certainly post-Yom Tov life in the midst of Sfiras HaOmer. Allow me to share a thought for Parshas Shemini, sort of a synopsis of my printed drasha, which you can download from today's email and the link that we provide on the YouTube description. We read, of course, about a terrible tragedy in Parshas Shemini. It's Rosh Chodesh Nisan. There's a tremendous celebration for the Jewish people. The Mishkan is being inaugurated, the tabernacle. It's the 8th day of the inaugural, the climax of the celebration. And tragically, Nadav and Avihu, Aharon's two elder sons, enter into the Holy of Holies, offer a foreign fire before God, and God takes their lives. The epic proportion of this tragedy is really unbelievable, and it gets only more exacerbated when you consider that Aaron and his two remaining sons, Elazar and Itamar, had the responsibility of continuing the service of the inaugural. They're the only Kohanim that are alive at this point, so they need to continue the service. And they do so with great dignity and with great honor. But in the aftermath of this tragedy, there seems to be a certain disagreement between Moshe and Aaron as far as how to proceed. And it revolves around a specific sacrifice, a specific korban, known as the Seir Rosh Chodesh, as the goat sin offering that the Torah prescribes that is to be brought on every Rosh Chodesh. This was the very first time that this sin offering was to be brought. Normally a korban chatat, a sin offering, is part of the animal is placed on the altar, and the remainder of the animal's flesh, is eaten by the Kohanim as a form of atoning for the sinful act. The Kohanim participate in that atonement by eating of the animal's flesh. In this particular instance, Aharon made a call that Moshe initially disagreed with, and the Torah records this point of contention. Aaron made the decision that instead of he and his sons eating from the korban chatas of Rosh Chodesh, they were going to completely incinerate it on the altar. Moshe discovers this after the fact, and he says, "Hey, what happened? You were supposed to eat this korban, not to completely incinerate it on the altar." Now, Aaron gives a response to Moshe, and it's really not clear from the verbiage in the Torah exactly what Aaron was saying. He essentially says, we've offered all of our sin offerings and our burnt offerings, and then this has happened. These things have happened to us. Do you think it would be good in God's eyes? And Moshe hears this, and he accepts the argument, and he realizes that Aaron is correct. It was the right move to go ahead and burn it. What was exactly the interchange over here? There's so much discussion going on over here in the Talmud and in all of the commentaries, but allow me to suggest to you something that is brought up, a very deep and profound idea from the Mei HaShiloach, Reb Mordechai Yosef Leiner, the Ishbitzer Rav, in the early 19th century, and he states as follows: the Rosh Chodesh sin offering, who sinned? Why is it that on every Rosh Chodesh the community has to bring a sin offering? The Zohar tells us something very strange, and it tells us that the sin offering that we bring every Rosh Chodesh is not for anything that the Jewish people have done wrong, but it's rather to atone for God's sin. God's sin? What did God do to require atonement? So the Zohar tells us that when God first created the sun and the moon, they were of the same size. We know this famous midrash. And eventually God had to shrink the moon. And this shrinkage, this act of shrinking the moon, is most manifest on Rosh Chodesh, when the moon is at its very, very smallest phase. And so every Rosh Chodesh, God needs atonement for that act of shrinking the moon. Now this is, of course, a very deep idea. It's a mystical idea. But one lesson that we can take from it is, as Rav Leiner explains, is as follows. What does the shrinking moon, what does this waxing and waning moon represent? It represents the imperfections of this world of Olam Hazeh. That's really what the moon is all about. It's a symbol, it's an icon of the vicissitudes of this life and how things seemingly go in cycles for no apparent reason. Sometimes the light is brighter in this world, sometimes the light is darker, sometimes the righteous prosper, sometimes the wicked prosper, sometimes you can see God's hand in the world, and sometimes it's very dark and occlusive, and it's very difficult to understand what's going on. That's what the changing phases of the moon really is, a symbol of representation of the flaw and the existence of evil in our imperfect and flawed world. And if that's the case, normally when a Kohen partakes of the eating of a korban, he is actually ingesting the flesh of the sinner's sacrifice in order to let the sinner know that he is now part of us again. He can return back to the community. But when a Kohen partakes of God's sin offering, essentially what the Kohen is acknowledging on behalf of the Jewish people is that we accept your judgment, God. We don't always understand why this world is so imperfect and so filled with unfairness and a lack of justice that is apparent in this imperfect world. But we accept it nonetheless. And that's essentially what the Kohen's role is when he partakes of the offering of the Rosh Chodesh Chatat, of that sin offering. And this is where Aharon had a different position from Moshe. Moshe says, why didn't you partake of this sin offering? And Aharon said to him, I understand that it's important for every Jew to wax theologically on a theoretical level and to acknowledge Kol man da'avid rachmana l'tav avid. I don't always understand it, but everything that God does is for the best. And that's fine in regular life. But look what just happened to me, Moshe. I just lost my two beloved sons. How do you expect me to make such an affirmation of faith and acceptance of God's judgment when I've barely buried my sons? How do you expect me to be able to act as a Kohen in light of what has happened to me? I'm only human. I can't even bring myself to physically eat the meat of this sin offering because I am a human being who is filled, I'm not a robot, I am filled with emotion. I am filled with the absolute tragedy of what has occurred to me. And so it's not fair for you, Moshe, to expect me to partake of this as the Kohen. You have to give me some latitude because I'm human. And Moshe listens to this argument according to the Ishbitzer, and he says, you know something, you're right. The human being is also imperfect. We were all created by God in this imperfect world, and we're part of that imperfection. And the limitations of the human psyche do not allow you to make this kind of affirmation when meto mutal lefanav, when you are the freshness of this tragedy is so real for you. And therefore, I assent to what you've done. Next Rosh Chodesh, you can take care of the sin offering of God and make that kind of acknowledgement theologically that everything that God does is for the good, despite the lack of justice and the imperfection of this world. But for now, you were right to not partake of that korban and to completely incinerate it. I hope that this current pandemic is not getting you down. There are so many blessings that we can find amidst the tragedies that are all around us in the world. But you have to also understand that you're human. We're all human. And it's certainly quite understandable if it's very difficult to be able to find those silver linings, especially if you're going through something with the loss of personally of a loved one. You can't be expected to be invulnerable and to be robotic in the way that you serve Hashem. If you're going through a difficult time, you have to be able to turn to Hashem and say, Ich kenisht, I can't do this. I know there's an imperative of Ivdu es Hashem b'simcha, I have to serve God with joy, but I'm having a tough time. And Hashem created you in the way that you are, and therefore you have to turn to Him and say, I'm not perfect, God, and you have to accept that because that's the way that you made me. That's the important message of the Ishbitzer. Now, of course, we always have to try to find joy in life, and there's so many different techniques to do that. Do an act of chesed for someone else. Go shopping for them, check in on an older neighbor, make sure that they're okay. Start a daily gratitude journal, and maybe even learn a new language, learn a new skill, learn how to paint, learn how to play music. There's so many things that you can do right now to fill your life with joy. But if you still can't bring yourself to joy right now or at any particular juncture during this isolation, lift up your eyes to heaven and say, Ribono Shel Olam, I can't do this. And God will understand. With God's help, we'll see an end to this current plight, hopefully very soon, and we'll see it through together. In the meantime, let's work together to do our share to make this world a better place and bring it to its ultimate perfection. B'mheira b'yameinu, amen. Wishing you a beautiful Shabbos, Shabbat Shalom.